Hatter, what's the last thing you remember? You and I had just finished the Incredible Journey review. We were coming back home, and then everything changed, right? Editing Matt's been messing with reality, making the genre of the thing we're reviewing into the genre of the review. Film noir to a musical to an epic. It was too much. Rifts started to appear in the fabric of reality. You and I disappeared through the very first of these rifts. I was sent just a few reviews hence, and was trapped in a Stephen King universe for longer than I care to remember. Where's Scotty? Who? Plaid hat, pretentious suit coat, reviews theater stuff. Scotty? How did... Sorry, Reg. You had to forget about me. It's the only way this was gonna work. When I snap my fingers, reality will change and a rift will open. You have to go find Reg and get him out of the Stephen King universe. It lasted for way too long and we don't need you guys reviewing Langoliers, you know what I'm saying? We need Hatter and Reg. We've never gone this long without doing a Books vs. Movies review. The people are clamoring for a new one. Looks like we have a new reviewer in our ranks. You seem able to carry on the burden of both Reg and Hatter.
Arcana, what are you talking about? I am Hatter.
We really can't do anything simply, can we? We really can't. Where the hell am I? What's going on? Who are you? I'm not mad. I just want to know what's going on. Yes, I remember you. You're my #1 fan. What am I doing here? Last I remember, we just finished the Incredible Journey review, and then something happened. Okay, well, I guess I'll just be on my way then. Where are we, Ed? Well, let's see. Washed out colors, desolate New England landscape, general feeling of despondency and loneliness mixed with a feeling of tension and weirdness. If I was a betting man, I'd say we landed in a Stephen King genre. But we agreed to stay away from Stephen King reviews when we saw Hatter's Trip to the Future. Ed, we can't become trapped here. I know. I didn't bring us here. Something beyond my control steered us into this genre. Well, we better find a way to get out of here before the end of the review, or else we're... Oh, finally, the Stephen King universe. I'm in the right time. Alright, you two. We gotta find Reg. What are you talking about? Ignored you in what? Seriously, bro, do I look mad to you? I just want to know what's going on. Oh, that. Wait, 34? You know I can't do a Books vs. Movies review by myself. Where's Hatter? was sucked into a time rip like you were, Hatter. He could be anywhere. It doesn't matter. Hatter, all you have to do is start a review. Any review, and he'll turn up. Right, but it's gotta be a Stephen King review to fit in with the genre. Fortunately, there are a lot to choose from. I've got just the one.
Stephen King is probably best known for his stories featuring...
Reg, Hatter! What the hell happened? Time rip, future apocalypse, alternate timeline, whole long, complicated story that we don't have time to get into right now. Where are you? We gotta start the review. Agreed. What review were you starting? Well, I was saying that Stephen King is probably best known for his stories about the supernatural, psychic powers, ghosts, or other things that are not of this world. However, I found that some of my favorite Stephen King stories are the ones that don't contain these supernatural elements. And one of my favorites of these is the story of a famous author who is at the mercy of his self-proclaimed #1 fan, a novel entitled Misery. You were gonna do Misery too? Well, sure. Over the course of the story, the author finds out that his caretaker is not mentally well and that his life is in very serious danger, particularly when she discovers that he has killed off one of her favorite characters in his most recent novel. And keep in mind, Stephen King wrote this novel well before obsessive internet fandoms and Tumblr freakouts and many of the other things that are a testament to the modern age of fanaticism. So, it stood the test of time remarkably well. That it has. And in 1990, the Rob Reiner directed movie adaptation came out, starring Kathy Bates and James Caan. And yes, it's...
These go to 11.
As you wish. President can't just go out on a date.
Meathead, dead from the neck up.
That Rob Reiner. But Reiner shows us that you don't have to be married to one particular genre or style of movie in your directing, and he puts together a very, very effective psychological thriller. He really digs into the psychological side of the story while also giving us an adaptation with a lot of suspense and tension. But can it compete with the master of suspense and tension? Let's find out. This is Books vs. Movies review of Stephen King's Misery. Alright, Reg, listen up. We don't have a lot of time. Your captor wants a review and he's not going to have a lot of patience with story-related stuff, which is what we need to get you out of there. I figure we'll have about 30 seconds between each round before he starts to get restless. Use those seconds wisely. Try to find a way out of there, and I'll try to find a way to find you. Got it? Scotty, Ed, I need your help. We'll do everything we can. Your time's about up. Right. Round 1 looks at our main protagonist, Paul Sheldon. Now, a lot of Stephen King stories feature authors, it obviously being a subject that Stephen King knows quite a bit about, and it's hard to say how autobiographical a lot of these characters are, but it's hard to look at Paul Sheldon and Stephen King alongside each other and not draw a number of parallels. They're both famous authors with a large number of obsessive fans, as well as more than a few harsh critics. Paul Sheldon, for example, is largely known for a series of formulaic historical soap operas called the Misery series, which fans adore, but which Paul Sheldon himself despises. He finds himself growing increasingly distant from writing the sort of stories that he enjoys and that he knows are good, and instead writing the sort of stories that he knows the fans will accept and that will make him the most money. Which is a pretty common ailment among popular writers, and yes, I'm looking at you, Piers Anthony. Seriously, stop writing the Xan series and stop being good about 20 years ago. To that end, he's decided he's going to take a huge risk at this point in his career and write his last Misery novel in which the character of Misery herself dies, and instead focus his attention on the novel that he wants to write, which is about as far away from Misery as it's possible to get. Additionally, it's obvious that he has no love for the fans of Misery, thinking less of them for enjoying what he considers to be inferior writing, and at the same time thinking very much of himself and his own talent. And to that end, he's kind of an ass. I mean, Paul Sheldon is just not a pleasant human being, something that we get to see firsthand in the book by looking so deeply inside his head. So he has a pretty negative bias towards Annie Wilkes, his self-proclaimed #1 fan, from the very beginning of the story. In the movie, this part is played by James Caan, who turns in a really great performance. And he's not a perfect human being by any means. He still has his various vices, his disparaging attitude towards fans of Misery, and his ego, but those aspects of his character are downplayed quite a bit in the movie, so that we're better able to sympathize with his character when Annie Wilkes starts beating on him, both figuratively and literally. And Caan does a really great job of showing us exactly what Sheldon is going through all this. Sheldon has to put on a nice face for Annie, even though he completely despises her, and Caan shows us that inner tension
function without revealing it to Annie. That's a nice bit of acting on his part. That's to say nothing of all the crap that Annie puts him through. This is a really great performance. But to be honest, I think the character from the book is still more interesting. Part of that is because of the very flaws that the movie downplays. Quite against his will, Paul Sheldon finds himself becoming a better person through his captivity with Annie. He kicks his smoking habit, though admittedly he does become addicted to another drug. He finds himself enjoying his writing again, and particularly enjoying writing the Misery series again, and he works very, very hard and actually finds himself writing some of his best work for Annie. And because we're allowed inside Paul Sheldon's head, we get an intimate look at storytelling and the creative process. A lot of parallels are drawn between Paul Sheldon's addiction to his painkillers and his addiction to his work. And through his work and his writing and Annie's own opinions, we're asked the questions: what constitutes a good story? Can a work that is popular also be good? And I love how writing this story becomes parallel to Paul's own situation, particularly in the childhood game of Can You, where you have to think up of some way to get out of a hypothetical situation. The situation here isn't hypothetical at all, but he's still playing the game. This is all possible because we're able to get inside Paul Sheldon's head and see his thought process and exactly how he reacts to this situation. So though James Caan did a great job in the movie, I've got to give this one to the book. Alright, Hatter, 30 seconds. I'm gonna try to find out as much as I can about this house. Ed, what am I looking for? Something creepy? It's Stephen King. Everything is creepy. You and Reg naturally want to be doing the review alongside of each other. Just keep doing the review and eventually you'll find each other. Time's up. Start the next round. Round 2 looks at easily the most memorable character in this story, the mentally unstable fan, Annie Wilkes. Annie Wilkes is a fascinating character in many ways. Most interesting to me is the fact that despite all the horrible things that she's done, she still has a very rigid moral code. She has a very acute sense of what is right and what is wrong, and anyone who is wrong, as she sees it, needs to be punished. So because Paul Sheldon writes books that she loves and created a character that she in many ways looks up to, she sees Paul Sheldon as a good person. However, when she discovers that Paul has vices, that he's not that pleasant to be around, and to top it all off, that he killed off her favorite character, she decides she needs to punish him. Annie Wilkes is a frightening villain because she is so familiar to anyone who is in the public eye. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to call myself famous in any way, but I do have a fair amount of people watching my videos. And while most of the comments I get are perfectly lovely, there are occasionally a few that make me wonder a little. Not even mean-spirited comments necessarily, but just comments that indicate that the commenter is maybe a little bit too invested in the self-made content of a 28-year-old man making a series of videos in tiny apartments. Actually, I'm probably not 28 anymore. How old am I now? I'm 30 now? And Annie is so invested in Paul Sheldon, both as an author and as a person, she feels the need to fix his various flaws. And as far as cruelty and general psychoticness goes, Annie is way worse in the book. She actually cuts off Paul Sheldon's foot to hobble him, where in the movie she just breaks his ankles. And she does murder a cop in both versions, but in the book she runs him over with a lawnmower, with the blade still running, whereas in the movie, she just shoots him. I also feel like we learn a little bit more about Annie in the book, really delving into her book of memories and learning more about her past, and particularly her past killings. The problem with Annie in the book, though, is that we see her entirely from Paul's point of view, and Paul has a pretty biased point of view of her from the start. It's pretty clear that he has a disparaging attitude toward anyone who is a fan of Misery, a series he feels to be inferior writing, and one of the first descriptions of Annie is that she's insane. We don't really get an opportunity to learn about her ourselves because Paul tells us everything about her from his own rather hateful point of view. In the movie, we learn about Annie's psychotic nature more gradually. When we first see her, she seems like a nice, if sheltered and simple woman, and then as we progress through the movie, we see more and more how unsettled she is and the different layers of her insanity. And Kathy Bates does a fantastic job of giving us a kind of unsettling impression of the character without outright telling us that she's crazy until it's time for us to know that she's crazy. She also does the mood swings really well, making the character unpredictable in the movie in a way that she really wasn't in the book, because again, Paul figured out how to chart her mood swings pretty early on. And really, this character is plenty frightening without the excessive cruelty and detailed backstory. Annie Wilkes isn't the type of character you get to know. She's the type of character who haunts your nightmares. So though it's a tough call, I think that Kathy Bates' performance of the characters swings the balance over to the movie side. Alright, 30 seconds, go! Next round. But what about the other characters in this two-character thriller? Granted, there aren't that many other characters. This is primarily a story about Paul Sheldon and Annie Wilkes. But one of the nice things about the movie is that we do get a look at the outside world as well. The book is just Paul and Annie, told from Paul's point of view, but in the movie we also get to follow the sheriff who is investigating Paul's disappearance, and I really like this character. He's the stereotypical small-town sheriff who does all the things, but he's a very likable character, and I love watching him get caught up in the case, even going so far as to read the Misery novels in order to better understand both Paul and his captor, which is kind of the same fallacy of logic that Annie makes, trying to make judgment on the author based on the author's work. Also, the interactions between this little old man and his wife are just adorable and provide some nice comic relief. In fact, these sequences break up the tension of the Paul and Annie scenes quite nicely because they take a break from being inside Paul's head and show us the real world for a while and remind us that there is a real world out there beyond Annie Wilkes. And we come to know this character so much that when Annie does kill him, it's genuinely shocking, not because the murder is overly grisly like it is in the book, but because we got to know and like this character and Annie just kills him in cold blood. But the fact that we don't get that relief in the book means that we understand much better what Paul Sheldon is going through when he feels like there's no escape from this place. Now granted, that's more of a story issue than a character issue, but there is a reason why King didn't have that many other characters. However, Sheldon is offered an escape from his hell, and that's where the writing of the Misery story comes in. The book actually shows us excerpts of what he's writing, and it illustrates to us how he's using his writing as an escape from, and in many ways as a parallel to, his own situation. The imaginary characters of Paul Sheldon's book are the other characters in this novel, and it's a really compelling element to this story, as King uses these characters to show us how the creative process works, what it's like to create your own characters and your own world, and what it's like to really escape into your own writing. So it really comes down to whether the imaginary characters from the book or the real characters from the movie are more compelling. For me personally, though I adore the imaginary characters from the book and what they add to the story, I found myself more attached to the sheriff and his wife from the movie. The characters in the Misery story are purposefully kind of stereotyped and cliched without a lot of three-dimensional characterization because that's not really the point of the story. They're essentially just supposed to be literary soap opera, and the fact that Sheldon uses them as an escape from his situation is what makes them interesting rather than the personalities themselves. The characters in the movie, on the other hand, are real people with real personalities that we actually get to know and like. And as characters, I find them more compelling, so I'm gonna go with the movie on this round, though again, only by a little bit. But now let's see how Rob Reiner's direction stands up to the imagination of Stephen King. This is actually a pretty interesting and consistent difference in the imagery between Stephen King's books and the movies based on those books. Or at least it's a pretty interesting and consistent difference in the few Stephen King books that I've read and the movies that I've watched. Stephen King's writing style is very detailed and very graphic. He writes in such a way to make you feel everything that his characters are feeling, particularly when his characters are feeling pain or fear, which in Stephen King stories they very often are. Sheldon in particular goes through a lot in this story. His legs are broken in a car accident, he becomes addicted to painkillers, he gets his foot chopped off, he watches a guy get run over by a lawnmower. It's not pretty. Stephen King definitely has a taste for gore, one that the movie made considerably more palatable. For example, the hobbling of Paul Sheldon just involves Annie breaking his ankles as opposed to cutting off his foot. And Annie does shoot a guy, but that's about as grisly as it gets when it comes to death in this book. The question then that always seems to spring to mind whenever I'm reading a Stephen King story is, how much is too much? At what point do we decide that King has crossed a line? I think there is something to the adage that less is more, and it is possible to over-describe. King is very graphic and very vivid in his descriptions, to the point where he doesn't leave a whole lot to the imagination. Plus, if this sort of graphic grisliness is the norm, you kind of become desensitized to it. Like, the scene where she runs over the police officer with the lawnmower is pretty gruesome, but it's not like we couldn't have guessed that that's where the scene was heading. And we can easily imagine it in horrifying detail, whereas in the movie where she shoots the sheriff, it's legitimately surprising and it catches us off guard. For this story though, I think the book's imagery works a little bit better, because we're inside Paul Sheldon's head, and Stephen King's descriptions of what's going on really draw us further into the story. And I'm not just talking about the pain, the fear, and the drug addiction here. Like I said before, this book really delves into what it's like to be a writer and what it's like to create your own characters in your own world. And the descriptions of Sheldon's obsession with his writing and his own work are really, really apt. Obviously, King would understand what that's like, but I think that the way that he describes it really helps us to understand Paul and his obsession in a really, really compelling way. For that reason, the book edges out the movie on this one. Good. Go ahead, unsubscribe, stop watching. You're annoying and unreasonable and idiotic. Why on earth would I care if you kept watching? Is that really all you've got? Jackass. Though both book and movie are telling the same story, they're told in very different ways. As we've already mentioned, the book is told entirely from the point of view of Paul Sheldon, which gives the book a very claustrophobic feeling. The advantage of this, of course, is that we can acutely feel what Paul Sheldon is feeling during the ordeal. But the movie has a lot of claustrophobic close-ups and a great feeling of suspense, and so it kind of gives us this feel as well. The movie also has the advantage of multiple viewpoints. Not only are we looking at Paul's story, but we're also looking into the drama of the sheriff who has gone looking for him. And what I like about this, aside from the character himself, is how another person gets drawn into the world of Paul Sheldon, even if it's just for the sake of the case. And like I also said earlier, it is nice to have these sequences to kind of break up the tension of being inside Paul Sheldon's head. I feel like the movie tells a more rounded story, with part of it being this mystery that the sheriff is trying to solve. But the movie is missing one major aspect that really makes the book stand out for me, and that's the inclusion of the story of misery that Paul Sheldon is writing and the exploration of what goes into creating a story. Upon discovering that Paul Sheldon has killed off her favorite character, Annie Wilkes goes crazy, and forces Paul to write another misery novel where he brings the character back. So Paul Sheldon is literally writing for his life, but the strange thing that happens is that he actually starts to get into writing these characters in this story again. Even though he killed off the character initially because he hated writing the misery novels and wanted to move on to something else, he finds himself getting back into the world that he created, and he ends up writing what he actually feels is one of his best works. King really does capture the creative process perfectly, and I love how the misery story reflects what's going on with Paul. And the inclusion of this part of the story also serves to break up the tension and add another layer to the narrative. What this story ultimately ends up being about, more than the drama of Paul Sheldon and Annie Wilkes, is the creative process and what really goes into telling a story. We really get a great insight into the character of Paul Sheldon and into the creative process itself, which propels the book beyond just another thriller, something that the movie really didn't manage to do. And in the end, this really is the story of an author, and it makes sense to include all aspects of his life and not just what's happening to him in the moment. So while I do enjoy the movie, I think the book provides a much richer and better story. And And that does it for another Books vs. Movies review. Hatter and I are, of course, happy to be back, and we're looking forward to providing more Books vs. Movies reviews in our new reviewing spaces. So until next time, I'm Regular Matt, and I'm the Mad Hatter. Take care.